Right now, wherever you are, the room around you is probably quiet. Maybe there is a fan humming somewhere, or a car passing outside, or just the soft static of silence that fills a house at night. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes, if they're not already closed, and just let your mind drift backward. Not minutes, not years, but almost 2,000 years, to a world that believed it would last forever. Because that's really where this story begins. Not with battles, not with barbarians at the gates, though we'll get to all of that, slowly, carefully, the way you'd walk through an old house at night with a candle. This story begins with an idea, the idea that Rome was eternal. The Romans had a phrase for it, Roma Eterna, eternal Rome. And they didn't say it as a hope, they said it as a fact, as obvious as the sun rising. For nearly 1,000 years before its final collapse in the West, Rome had been the center of the world as far as most of its citizens were concerned. Empires rose and fell elsewhere. Dynasties in Persia and Egypt and Mesopotamia came and went like weather. But Rome simply was. It was the water you swam in. It was the ground beneath your feet.
So tonight, you and I are going to walk through how that idea died. Slowly, unevenly, over centuries. Not in a single dramatic night, though there was a night like that too, and we'll get there. We're going to walk through the slow erosion of an empire, through emperors who held the world together with sheer force of will, and emperors who let it slip through their fingers, through plagues and civil wars and economic collapses that crept in so gradually that people alive during them often couldn't see what was happening until it was far too late. We're going to talk about the cities that emptied out, the roads that stopped being repaired, the legions that stopped being legions, and the slow, quiet, almost imperceptible moment when Rome stopped being the center of anything at all. There is no need to remember any of this. No test at the end, no quiz, nothing you need to hold on to. If you drift off somewhere in the middle of a sentence about an emperor whose name you've never heard before, that's perfectly fine. The story will still be here, waiting, patient, the way history always is. So let's settle in. Let's get comfortable, and let's go back very slowly to the beginning of the end.
Let's start, actually, not with decline, but with the high point, because you can't understand a fall without first understanding the height from which something fell. Picture the year 117 of the Common Era. The emperor is a man named Trajan, a soldier emperor from Spain, one of the so-called 5 good emperors that later historians, particularly the 18th century writer Edward Gibbon, would point to as the peak of human civilization up to that point. Under Trajan, the Roman Empire reached its absolute maximum size. It stretched from the misty hills of Scotland in the north to the deserts of Mesopotamia in the east, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the Persian Gulf. Picture that for a moment. A single political entity, one system of law, one currency, one network of roads, spanning roughly 2 million square miles. Something like 50 to 90 million people lived under Roman rule. Historians still debate the exact number, but either way, it was perhaps a quarter, maybe even closer to a third of the entire population of the world at that time.
And here's the thing that's almost hard to wrap your mind around. A person could walk or ride or sail from the Scottish border to the banks of the Euphrates River in what is now Iraq and never leave Roman territory. They'd pass through the same kind of administration, see the same kind of coinage, hear Latin spoken by officials, even in the furthest provinces, eat food brought along the same trade networks. There's a wonderful detail historians love to point out. Pepper, grown in India, regularly made its way to dinner tables in Britain, carried along a chain of trade routes that the Roman peace, the famous Pax Romana, made possible. Think about that for a second. A spice from the Indian subcontinent,
on a table in a province at the literal edge of the known world, in an era without engines, without telegraphs, without anything we'd recognize as fast transportation. That's what an empire at its height looks like. That's the world Rome built.
But, and here's where the story really starts. Here's the catch that runs underneath everything we're about to talk about. Empires that large, that complex, carry within them the seeds of their own difficulty. Not necessarily their own destruction, not yet, but certainly difficulty. Because how you govern 50 or 90 million people spread across that much territory with the communication technology of the 2nd century. A message from Rome to the legions stationed on the Rhine River in what's now Germany might take weeks to arrive. A message to the eastern frontier near Persia might take over a month. The emperor in Rome was, in a very real sense, perpetually out of date with events happening at the edges of his own empire. And this is something worth really pausing on, because it's going to matter more and more as our story moves forward. An empire that large requires not just an extraordinary leader, but extraordinary systems, bureaucracies, tax structures, communication networks, military logistics, systems that have to function correctly almost all the time, because the consequences of them breaking down ripple out across enormous distances. For about 200 years, give or take, starting roughly from the reign of Augustus, the first emperor, who took power after the chaos of civil wars following Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, those systems mostly worked. Historians sometimes call this the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period running from around 27 BCE to about 180 CE. It wasn't peaceful everywhere all the time. There were rebellions, there was fighting on the frontiers, but compared to what came before and what came after, it was remarkably stable. Trade flourished, cities grew, engineering projects we still marvel at today, aqueducts carrying water for dozens of miles using nothing but the careful calculation of gradient and gravity, road networks so well built that some sections are still walkable today, nearly 2,000 years later. These were the products of a civilization that believed, with total confidence, in its own permanence. So let's slow down for a moment and sit with that confidence, because I think it's important to understanding everything that follows. If you had asked a Roman citizen in the year 150, someone living comfortably in, say, the city of Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon in France, whether Rome would still exist in another 500 years, they would have looked at you like you'd asked whether the sun would still rise. Of course it would. Rome had survived Hannibal's invasion centuries before, had survived civil wars, had survived the assassination of Julius Caesar and the chaos that followed. Rome was simply permanent in their minds, the way that, frankly, many of us today think of our own nations, our own systems, our own institutions. It's a very human thing, this assumption of permanence. And it's worth remembering, as we move forward through this story, that the people living through the slow decline we're about to discuss didn't know they were living through a decline. Most of them thought they were simply living through difficult times that would eventually pass, the way difficult times always had before. Now, here's where things start to shift, very gradually at first, almost imperceptibly. The year 180 is often marked by historians as a turning point, mostly because it's the year the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius died. Marcus Aurelius is a figure worth pausing on for a moment, because he's one of those rare historical personalities who feels almost startlingly modern when you read his private writings, the collection we now call the Meditations, which he never intended to be published, just personal notes to himself, often written in military camps on the frontier, dealing with wars he didn't particularly want to fight. There's something deeply human about Marcus Aurelius. He was, by most accounts, a reluctant warrior, a man who would rather have spent his life reading Stoic philosophy than commanding legions against Germanic tribes along the Danube River. And yet that's exactly what he spent much of his reign doing, fighting what are now called the Marcomannic Wars, a long, grinding conflict against various Germanic peoples pressing against the empire's northern frontier.
And here's something worth really sitting with. Those wars, fought by Marcus Aurelius in the 160s, 170s, into the 180s, were in some ways an early tremor, a warning sign of pressures that would, over the following centuries, only intensify. peoples living beyond the Roman frontier, in the forests and plains of what's now Germany, Poland, and further east, were themselves under pressure, pushed and pulled by population movements, by climate shifts, by the rise and fall of their own confederations and alliances. Some of these pressures, fascinatingly, modern climate scientists studying ice cores and tree rings have actually been able to trace. There's a body of research suggesting that the period from roughly 150 to 450 CE saw increasing climatic instability across Eurasia, a cooling trend that affected agriculture and, in turn, pushed populations to migrate in search of better land. We'll come back to this later, this idea of climate as a quiet, invisible character in our story, working in the background for centuries. But let's back up a moment, because I don't want to rush ahead of ourselves. After Marcus Aurelius died in 180, his son Commodus became emperor, and Commodus is, frankly, where things start to go visibly wrong at the very top. If you've seen the film Gladiator, you'll have some sense of Commodus, though the historical reality is, as always, stranger and more specific than the movie version. Commodus believed himself to be the reincarnation of Hercules. He fought in the gladiatorial arena himself, something previous emperors would have considered deeply undignified, beneath the office. And by most ancient accounts, he was vain, erratic, and increasingly paranoid as his reign wore on. He was eventually assassinated in 192, strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus, after a conspiracy involving his own mistress and several court officials who feared for their lives. Think about what that actually means for a moment. The transition from Marcus Aurelius, a man who wrote private philosophical reflections on duty and mortality and the fleeting nature of fame, to his own son, a man who renamed the city of Rome after himself and fought lions in the arena for sport. It's a jarring transition, and it illustrates something that's going to be a recurring theme throughout our entire story tonight. The Roman imperial system had no reliable mechanism for ensuring good leadership. There was no parliament that could remove a bad emperor through ordinary process, no clear agreed-upon rule for succession beyond whoever the previous emperor named, assuming the army agreed. And when the army didn't agree, which happened more and more often as the centuries wore on, you got civil war.
After Commodus's assassination, the empire plunged into what's called the Year of the Five Emperors, 193, a chaotic stretch in which multiple claimants fought for the throne. The imperial position essentially auctioned off at one point by the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own bodyguard, to the highest bidder. A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus literally outbid another candidate for the throne, only to be executed within months once a general named Septimius Severus marched on Rome with his legions and took power by force. Sit with that for a second. The throne of the most powerful empire in the world, auctioned like property, to whoever could pay the soldiers enough. That's not a system in good health. That's a system already showing cracks. Even if from the outside, the empire still looked enormous and unshakable. Septimius Severus, once he secured power, actually managed to stabilize things for a while. He was a capable, if ruthless, administrator, and his dynasty held on through several successors. But the underlying instability never really went away. And this brings us, gradually, to what historians often call the crisis of the 3rd century. And I want to take some real time with this period, because in many ways it's a preview, a dress rehearsal, for the final collapse that would come roughly 200 years later. If you understand the 3rd century crisis, you understand in miniature almost everything that eventually destroyed the Western Empire for good.
Here's the situation. Starting around the year 235, the emperor at that time, Severus Alexander, was assassinated by his own troops, who were frustrated with what they saw as weak leadership against Germanic incursions. And once that line was crossed, Once it became normalized that soldiers could simply kill an emperor they were unhappy with and elevate one of their own generals instead, the floodgates opened. Over the following roughly 50 years, historians count more than 20 different men claiming the imperial title, most of them killed within months or a few years of taking power, usually by their own soldiers or by rival generals. The empire fractured, quite literally, into three competing pieces for a time: a breakaway Gallic empire in the west, covering modern France, Britain, and parts of Spain and Germany, and a breakaway Palmyrian empire in the east, centered on the Syrian city of Palmyra, and led, fascinatingly, by a woman, Queen Zenobia, who claimed descent from Cleopatra, and who for several remarkable years in the early 270s controlled Egypt, Syria, and large parts of Asia Minor, defying Roman authority entirely. Can you imagine what it must have felt like to live through that if you were an ordinary person, a farmer, a merchant, a craftsman, somewhere in the Roman provinces during the 3rd century crisis? The currency you'd grown up trusting was being debased, the silver content of Roman coins dropping dramatically as cash-strapped, short-lived emperors tried to pay their soldiers with whatever metal they could scrape together. By some estimates, the silver content of the primary Roman coin, the denarius, dropped from around 90% silver under Augustus to less than 5% by the 270s. That's hyperinflation. That's a currency essentially being hollowed out from the inside, and with it, an entire economic system built on trust in that currency starting to wobble.
And here's something genuinely worth pausing on. Alongside the political chaos and the economic collapse, the empire was also struck during this same general period by a devastating pandemic, what's now called the Plague of Cyprian, named after a bishop who wrote about its horrors, which swept through the empire starting around 249 CE and continued in waves for roughly 20 years. We don't know with total certainty what disease it was, possibly a viral hemorrhagic fever, possibly smallpox. The historical record is frustratingly vague on the specific symptoms in ways that would let modern epidemiologists pin it down precisely, but contemporary accounts describe it as horrifying, with some cities reportedly losing thousands of people per day at its peak. The Greek physician and writer Cyprian himself described people too afraid to bury their own family members, streets littered with the dead, and a sense of total societal breakdown. Some historians estimate the plague may have killed as much as a third of the population in certain regions, though precise numbers from this era are always somewhat speculative, given the limitations of ancient record-keeping.
So, picture this convergence. And this is, I think, one of the most important things to understand about why empires fall, not just Rome, but any large, complex system. It's rarely just one thing. It's never just barbarians invaded or the economy collapsed as a single clean cause. It's convergence. It's multiple stresses arriving at once, each one weakening the system's ability to respond to the others. In the 3rd century, you had political instability undermining military effectiveness, military instability undermining the ability to defend the frontiers, frontier weakness allowing more raids and incursions from outside groups, those incursions disrupting trade and agriculture, that disruption feeding economic collapse, that collapse making it harder to pay and supply the army, which fed back into political instability as unpaid, unhappy soldiers turned on their own commanders and emperors. It's a vicious cycle, a feedback loop, and once you understand how it worked in the 3rd century, you start to see the same pattern playing out more slowly, more grindingly, across the final 2 centuries of the Western Empire's existence. Now here's the remarkable part, the part that I think makes the 3rd century crisis such an important chapter in our story. Rome recovered. Not fully, not perfectly, but it recovered, largely under 2 extraordinarily capable emperors,
Aurelian, who reigned from 270 to 275 and managed to reunify the fractured empire, defeating Zenobia's Palmyrene forces and reclaiming the breakaway Gallic territories, earning himself the title Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. And then, a bit later, Diocletian, who took power in 284, and who in many ways fundamentally redesigned how the Roman Empire functioned in an attempt to prevent exactly the kind of chaos that had nearly destroyed it.
Diocletian is worth pausing on for a good while, because the changes he made would shape everything that followed, right up until the final collapse. Diocletian recognized something important. The empire had simply grown too large, too complex for a single man to effectively govern and defend, especially given the speed of communication and travel available at the time. So in 286, he did something radical. He split the empire administratively into two halves, Eastern and Western, each governed by its own emperor, though in theory still unified as a single empire. He later expanded this into what's called the Tetrarchy, the rule of four, with two senior emperors called Augusti and two junior emperors called Caesars, each responsible for a quarter of the empire's vast territory, theoretically working in coordinated harmony. The Tetrarchy itself didn't last terribly long as Diocletian designed it. Within a couple of decades of his retirement in 305, civil wars broke out again as the various tetrarchs and their sons jockeyed for supreme power, eventually resolving in the rise of one of history's truly pivotal figures, Constantine. And let's sit with Constantine for a while, because his reign, starting in 306 and lasting until 337, set in motion two changes that would profoundly shape the empire's final centuries.
The first change was religious. In 312, before a crucial battle against a rival named Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge just outside Rome, Constantine reportedly had a vision. Accounts vary in the details, some describing a cross of light in the sky, others a dream the night before, instructing him to mark his soldiers' shields with a Christian symbol. He won the battle decisively, and from that point forward, Constantine became the empire's first Christian emperor, issuing the Edict of Milan in 313, which granted religious tolerance to Christians throughout the empire after centuries of often brutal persecution. Think about that for a second. A religion that had just decades earlier seen its adherents thrown to wild animals in the very arenas where Commodus once fought for sport was now, within a single generation, becoming associated with the imperial throne itself. By the end of the 4th century, under the Emperor Theodosius, Christianity would become not just tolerated, but the empire's official state religion, and the old Roman gods, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, the whole pantheon that had defined Roman religious life for the better part of 1,000 years, would be formally suppressed.
The second change Constantine set in motion was, in some ways, even more consequential for our story tonight. In 330, he founded a new capital city on the site of an ancient Greek colony called Byzantium, on the shores of the Bosphorus Strait, the narrow waterway separating Europe from Asia. He named this new city after himself, Constantinople, the city of Constantine, and poured enormous resources into building it up as a glittering Eastern capital, with its own senate, its own grand palaces, its own version of the Circus Maximus for chariot racing. And here's something worth really sitting with, because it's easy to miss the significance at the time. By creating this powerful, well-defended Eastern capital, with rich agricultural lands in Egypt and Anatolia to draw on, and by increasingly directing administrative attention and resources eastward, the seeds were quietly being planted for the eventual dramatic divergence in fortunes between the Roman East and the Roman West.
Let's stay with this a moment, because it matters enormously for understanding what happens over the following century. The eastern half of the empire, what would eventually become known after the Western collapse as the Byzantine Empire, though the people living in it always simply called themselves Romans, had several inherent advantages. Its cities, including Constantinople itself, Antioch, and Alexandria, were older, larger, and wealthier than most Western cities. Egypt, part of the Eastern Empire, was an extraordinarily productive agricultural region, thanks to the Nile's predictable annual flooding, capable of feeding enormous populations. The Eastern Mediterranean trade networks, connecting to the Silk Road and to Indian Ocean commerce, brought in wealth that the Western provinces, increasingly cut off by disrupted frontiers, simply couldn't match. The Western Empire, by contrast, was geographically more exposed, longer frontiers along the Rhine and Danube rivers to defend against Germanic peoples, a more agriculturally marginal economy in many regions, and increasingly over the 4th century, a sense that the West was becoming, in practical terms, the empire's frontier, the place where the fighting happened, while wealth and administrative attention increasingly flowed toward the glittering safety of Constantinople in the East.
Now, here's where we need to talk about a chain of events that historians have spent centuries debating, arguing about, revising: the role of a nomadic people called the Huns in triggering what's sometimes called the migration period, or in older and more dramatic terminology, the Völkerwanderung, the wandering of the peoples. And I want to take this slowly because it's genuinely one of the most fascinating and consequential developments in our entire story. Sometime in the 370s, a confederation of nomadic horse warriors from the Central Asian steppe, the Huns, whose exact origins remain somewhat mysterious to historians, possibly connected to or influenced by earlier steppe confederations from even further east, began pushing westward into Eastern Europe, into the territories north of the Black Sea, where a Germanic people called the Goths had been living. The Huns were, by virtually all contemporary accounts, ferociously effective mounted warriors, using composite bows that could be fired accurately from horseback. And their arrival triggered a kind of domino effect, a chain reaction of displacement that would, over the following decades, fundamentally destabilize the Roman frontier.
The Goths, specifically a branch called the Tervingi, soon to become known as the Visigoths, found themselves squeezed between the advancing Huns and the Roman frontier along the Danube River, and in 376, facing what was, by most accounts, genuine desperation, tens of thousands of Gothic refugees, men, women, children, entire communities, arrived at the Danube and asked the Roman authorities for permission to cross into imperial territory, to settle as refugees within the relative safety of Roman borders, in exchange for which they offered military service. Can you imagine being a Roman provincial governor on that frontier, watching tens of thousands of desperate, frightened people arrive at your border, asking to be let in? It's a scene that, frankly, doesn't feel entirely foreign to us even now, watching our own modern world grapple with displacement and migration on its own borders. The Eastern emperor at the time, Valens, made the fateful decision to allow the Goths to cross, partly out of a genuine, if cynical, calculation that they could be useful as soldiers and laborers, but the process was badly mismanaged from the start. Roman officials on the ground reportedly engaged in widespread corruption and exploitation, overcharging the desperate refugees for food, in some terrible accounts, even trading dog meat for Gothic children to be sold into slavery. The mistreatment was severe enough and sustained enough that the Goths eventually rose up in open revolt against Roman authority.
This led, in August of the year 378, to one of the most consequential military disasters in Roman history, the Battle of Adrianople. Emperor Valens, impatient and perhaps eager for a quick victory before reinforcements arrived from the Western Emperor, attacked the Gothic forces near the city of Adrianople, in what's now European Turkey, without waiting for his full army to be properly arrayed. The battle was a catastrophe for Rome. The Gothic cavalry caught the Roman infantry in a devastating flanking maneuver, and by the time the fighting ended, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the entire Eastern Roman field army had been killed. Estimates suggest somewhere between 10 and 20,000 soldiers, an almost unimaginable loss for a single afternoon of fighting in the ancient world.
Emperor Valens himself was killed in the chaos, his body never definitively identified afterward, lost somewhere amid the slaughter. Sit with that for a moment, because the Battle of Adrianople is, in many ways, a hinge point in our entire story. The Roman military, the institution that had underpinned the empire's existence for centuries, had just suffered one of its worst defeats ever, at the hands of a people who, just 2 years earlier, had arrived at the border as desperate refugees. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing not long after the battle, compared it to the legendary Roman disaster at Cannae centuries earlier, when Hannibal had annihilated a Roman army during the Second Punic War. And the psychological impact, beyond the purely military one, was enormous. It shattered for many Romans that old assumption of permanence, of inevitability, that we talked about earlier in this story. If barbarian refugees could destroy an entire Roman field army and kill an emperor, what exactly was still guaranteed about Rome's future?
Now, here's where things get genuinely strange, in a way I think is worth pausing on, because the next several decades don't follow a simple, clean narrative of decline. The new Eastern emperor, Theodosius, managed to negotiate a settlement with the Goths in 382, allowing them to settle within imperial territory as a semi-autonomous group while still nominally part of the empire. An arrangement that worked, more or less, for a while, but that also established an uncomfortable precedent: large groups of armed, organized peoples living within Roman borders, loyal more to their own leaders than to the distant emperor. And after Theodosius died in 395, having briefly reunited the entire empire under his sole rule, the last time that would ever happen, he divided the empire between his 2 sons, Arcadius, who took the eastern half, ruling from Constantinople, and Honorius, just a child at the time, who took the western half. From this point forward, the eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire would never again be administratively reunited. They would still for a while consider themselves parts of a single Roman state, sharing a common heritage and often coordinating, at least in theory. But in practice, from 395 onward, we're really telling 2 increasingly separate stories. And ours tonight, the story of decline and fall, becomes increasingly focused on the western half, the half that was heading, slowly, unevenly, toward genuine collapse.
The Western Emperor Honorius, just a boy when he came to power, was by most historical accounts a weak and largely ineffective ruler, more interested, according to some ancient sources, in raising chickens than in governing an empire under increasing strain. Real power in the West during his reign rested largely with his military commander, a man of partial Vandal, meaning Germanic, heritage, named Stilicho, who served as a kind of regent and chief general, and who, for a time, managed to hold the crumbling western frontier together through a combination of military skill and political maneuvering. But let's pause here and talk about a figure who looms enormously over this entire period: Alaric, king of the Visigoths, the same Gothic people whose ancestors had crossed the Danube as refugees back in 376. Alaric is a fascinating, almost tragic figure when you really sit with his story. He had actually served for periods within the Roman military system itself, leading Gothic troops as foederati, allied forces, and seems to have genuinely sought for much of his career not the destruction of Rome, but rather formal incorporation, recognition, a proper position within the Roman command structure, perhaps the rank of Magister Militum, Master of Soldiers, the highest military office in the Western Empire. Time and again, he negotiated with Roman authorities for land, for payment, for status, and time and again those negotiations broke down. Sometimes due to political infighting in Ravenna, where the Western imperial court had relocated for greater defensive security, sometimes due to the simple, persistent unwillingness of the Roman elite to grant a barbarian leader, however capable, the legitimacy he sought.
After Stilicho, Alaric's sometime rival, sometime negotiating partner, was executed in 408 on the orders of the paranoid Honorius, who had come to suspect, probably wrongly, that Stilicho was plotting against him. The fragile balance that had been holding the western frontier together
began to genuinely unravel. Alaric, frustrated by years of broken promises and unfulfilled negotiations, marched on Rome itself, not once, but ultimately 3 times between 408 and 410, laying siege to the city, extracting enormous ransoms of gold and silver and pepper, that same precious spice we talked about earlier, in exchange for temporarily withdrawing. And then, on the 24th of August in the year 410, after negotiations broke down one final time, Alaric's forces entered the city of Rome itself and sacked it. Now, I want to be careful here, because the popular imagination often pictures this as a moment of total annihilation, the city burned to the ground. But the historical reality, while still genuinely traumatic, was somewhat more measured. Alaric, who was himself an Arian Christian, reportedly ordered his troops to spare churches and those who took refuge within them, and the sack lasted only about 3 days. Still, it was the first time in roughly 800 years, since the Gauls had sacked the city way back in 387 BCE, that Rome itself, the eternal city, had fallen to a foreign army.
Think about what that actually meant psychologically across the Roman world. St. Jerome, the scholar and theologian, was living in Bethlehem at the time, working on his great translation of the Bible, and upon hearing the news, he wrote with evident anguish that his voice failed him and sobs interrupted his words as he tried to describe what had happened. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. It's worth sitting with that quote for a moment. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. There's something almost poetic, almost unbearably sad in that simple reversal. And here's something worth pausing on, because it connects to that bigger theme we discussed earlier, the death of the assumption of permanence. The sack of Rome in 410 prompted St. Augustine of Hippo in North Africa to begin writing one of the most influential works of Western philosophy and theology, The City of God, partly as a response to pagan critics who blamed Rome's misfortune on its abandonment of the old gods in favor of Christianity. Augustine's argument, sprawling across more than 20 books written over more than a decade, was essentially that earthly cities, even Rome, even the eternal city, were always temporary, always fallible, and that true permanence could only be found in the city of God, the heavenly community of the faithful, not in any earthly political arrangement. It's a profound philosophical pivot, born directly out of the trauma of watching Rome fall, even partially, even temporarily. A recognition, articulated by one of history's great minds, that nothing built by human hands, however grand, however ancient, however confident in its own permanence, is actually permanent.
Now, after the sack of 410, Alaric died not long after, reportedly of a fever, while planning to cross into North Africa, and, according to legend, his Gothic followers diverted a river, buried him with treasure in the riverbed, and then redirected the water back over the grave, killing the slaves who had done the digging to keep the location secret forever. A story that's almost certainly more legend than fact, but a haunting image nonetheless. The Visigoths eventually moved on, settling in southern Gaul and later Spain, where they would establish a long-lasting kingdom. But the damage to the Western Empire's stability, its finances, its sense of itself was severe, and it kept coming. Let's slow down and walk through, somewhat more quickly now because there's so much ground to cover, the cascade of losses that followed across the 5th century. Britain, the furthest northwestern province, the one Trajan's empire had once stretched to encompass, was essentially abandoned by Roman authority around 410, with the imperial government formally telling British communities they would need to look to their own defense, as the resources to maintain the province simply weren't available anymore. Gaul, modern France, increasingly fragmented, with various Germanic groups, Franks, Burgundians, and others, establishing settlements and eventually independent kingdoms within what had been Roman territory.
Spain similarly saw the establishment of a Visigothic kingdom, and North Africa, and this one really matters because North Africa was one of the wealthiest, most agriculturally productive regions of the Western Empire. The breadbasket that helped feed the city of Rome itself fell to a Germanic people called the Vandals, who crossed from Spain in 429 under their king Gaiseric, and by 439 had captured the great city of Carthage, establishing an independent Vandal kingdom that, crucially, also built a formidable navy and began raiding Roman shipping and coastal cities throughout the Western Mediterranean.
And here's the thing, and this is genuinely one of the most important points to understand about the Western Empire's final decline. The loss of North Africa was in many ways an economic death blow from which the West never really recovered. North African grain shipments had fed the city of Rome for centuries. North African tax revenue had funded significant portions of the Western military budget. Once that province was lost, the Western Roman government found itself with a shrinking tax base, trying to fund an army that, paradoxically, needed to be larger than ever to deal with multiple simultaneous threats across a now badly fragmented territory. It's a brutal, self-reinforcing spiral. Less territory means less revenue. Less revenue means a smaller, weaker military. A smaller, weaker military means it's harder to defend or reclaim territory, which means even less revenue. Sit with that cycle for a moment, because it's the engine, really, driving the final decades of the Western Empire's existence. Now, let's talk about a figure whose very name became, for centuries afterward, a byword for terror and destruction: Attila the Hun. Attila came to lead the Hunnic Confederation alongside his brother Bleda for a time before he had Bleda killed and took sole power in the 430s and 440s, and under his leadership the Huns became an enormously powerful and threatening force on the edges of both the Eastern and Western Roman worlds, extracting massive tribute payments from the Eastern Empire in particular, and conducting devastating raids across the Balkans.
The Romans, fascinatingly, by this point, were so weakened militarily that diplomacy and bribery had become primary tools of frontier management, alongside, or sometimes instead of, military force. There's a remarkable historical account written by a Roman diplomat and historian named Priscus, who actually traveled to Attila's camp on a diplomatic mission in 449, and left us one of the only detailed eyewitness descriptions of the Hunnic court that survives from antiquity. Priscus describes Attila, somewhat surprisingly, as a man of relatively simple personal habits compared to the lavish luxury of his followers and the Roman elite, eating from wooden plates while his guests ate from silver and gold, wearing plain clothing while his commanders wore elaborate jewelry, a detail that stuck with historians for centuries as a small, humanizing glimpse into a figure otherwise remembered almost entirely as a destructive force, a kind of historical boogeyman, the scourge of God, as later Christian writers would call him. In 451, Attila led a massive invasion into Gaul, and here's where we get one of the more remarkable moments in this whole declining story. A Roman general named Flavius Aetius, often called somewhat dramatically the last of the Romans by later historians, managed to assemble a coalition that included not just Roman forces, but also Visigoths, Franks, and other groups who had just decades earlier been fighting against Rome, all uniting against the common threat posed by Attila's invasion. This combined force met Attila's army at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, somewhere in what's now northeastern France, and after a brutal, bloody engagement, the Huns were checked, forced to withdraw, not destroyed, but stopped. It's worth pausing on this moment because it shows something genuinely remarkable. Even at this late, weakened stage, Rome could still, when truly necessary, function as an organizing, coordinating force capable of rallying former enemies against a shared existential threat. The old system wasn't entirely dead yet. It still had, in this one crucial moment, just enough strength left to avert total catastrophe.
Attila invaded Italy itself the following year, in 452,
sacking several northern Italian cities, but reportedly turned back before reaching Rome itself after a meeting with Pope Leo I. The historical details of exactly why Attila withdrew remain somewhat debated. Possibly disease was spreading through his army. Possibly the harvest had failed and supplies were running low. But the legend that grew up around it credited the Pope's diplomatic intervention, and it's a moment that significantly boosted the prestige and authority of the papacy in the centuries that followed, as secular Roman imperial power continued its long, slow fade. Attila died not long after, in 453, reportedly on his wedding night, possibly from a severe nosebleed exacerbated by heavy drinking, and without his singular leadership, the Hunnic Confederation rapidly fragmented and dissolved as a major power. But the Western Roman Empire, even having survived Attila, was by this point a shadow, really, of what it had once been. Aetius, the general who had organized the victory at the Catalaunian plains, was murdered in 454 by the Emperor Valentinian III himself, who apparently feared Aetius's growing power and influence. And then, in a moment of almost darkly ironic symmetry, Valentinian III himself was assassinated the following year, in 455, by supporters loyal to Aetius, avenging their fallen general. Think about that for a second. The very year after Rome's empire survived its most existential threat in generations, its emperor murdered the general who had saved it, and was then murdered in turn. This is not the behavior of a stable, confident political system. This is a system eating itself, piece by piece, even as external threats continued to mount on every side.
That same chaotic year, 455, the Vandal king Gaiseric, remember him from North Africa, sailed his fleet to Rome itself and sacked the city a second time. This sack is actually the origin of our modern word vandalism, though, interestingly, modern historians generally agree the Vandals' actual conduct during this sack wasn't dramatically worse than other sacks of the period. The word's negative connotation seems to have developed later, somewhat unfairly attached to this specific group. Still, the symbolic weight of Rome being sacked a second time within 45 years was, for contemporaries, almost unbearably significant. Now, here's something worth really pausing on, because it speaks to just how hollowed out the Western imperial system had become by this point. For the final 2 decades of its formal existence, the Western Roman Empire was ruled by a rapid succession of largely powerless emperors, often installed and removed by Germanic military commanders who held the actual power, but who, for various reasons, sometimes religious, sometimes related to their own legitimacy concerns, chose to rule through puppet emperors rather than claiming the imperial title outright themselves. It's a fascinating, almost theatrical final act. The form of Roman imperial authority persisting, the ceremonies, the titles, the trappings, even as the substance had largely drained away.
And this brings us finally, slowly, to the year 476, the date most commonly cited, though as we'll discuss, the reality is more complicated than a single clean date, as the end of the Western Roman Empire. A Germanic military commander named Odoacer, who had risen to lead a mixed group of Germanic soldiers serving within the Roman military, deposed the reigning Western emperor, a young boy, ironically and almost poignantly named Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus, sharing his name with both Rome's legendary founder, Romulus, and its first emperor, Augustus. There's something almost too neatly symbolic about that name, isn't there? The last emperor of Rome, bearing in diminutive form the names of both the city's mythical founder and its first true ruler. Odoacer, having deposed young Romulus Augustulus, made a decision that, in retrospect, historians often point to as the real, formal end of the Western Empire as a distinct political entity. Rather than installing another puppet emperor, he sent the imperial regalia, the crown, the purple robes, the symbols of imperial authority, to Constantinople, to the Eastern Emperor Zeno, with a message suggesting that one emperor was sufficient for the whole Roman world, and that he, Odoacer, would simply rule Italy as a king under Zeno's nominal authority,
rather than maintaining the fiction of a separate Western emperor.
And of course, and this is something worth genuinely pausing on, because it's easy to forget when we talk about the fall of Rome. The eastern half of the empire, centered on Constantinople, didn't fall in 476 at all. It continued, calling itself simply the Roman Empire, its people calling themselves Romans, for nearly another 1,000 years, until the city of Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Think about that span of time for a moment. Nearly a millennium separates the fall of Rome in the West from the actual final end of the last continuously functioning Roman state in the East. The Byzantine Empire, as later historians would name it, though again its own people simply called themselves Romans throughout its entire existence, preserved Roman law, codified most comprehensively under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century in a document called the Corpus Juris Civilis that would go on to shape legal systems across Europe for centuries afterward, preserved Roman administrative traditions, preserved, crucially, vast amounts of classical Greek and Roman literature and learning that might otherwise have been lost entirely to history, later transmitting much of that knowledge back to Western Europe during the Renaissance, helping fuel that great flowering of art, science, and learning.
So, in some very real sense, and I think this is a genuinely comforting thought to end this part of our journey on, Rome never actually fully, completely died. It transformed. It fragmented in the West into new political forms, new kingdoms that would eventually become the foundations of modern France, Spain, Italy, and beyond. While in the East, it simply continued, under a different name given to it by later historians, for another 1,000 years. The Roman Empire didn't fall so much as it very, very slowly, very unevenly, changed into something else, something that historians have spent centuries trying to precisely define and date, often disagreeing significantly with each other in the process. Now, let's take some time, because we still have a good while together tonight, and there's no rush, none at all, to talk through the deeper structural causes that historians have proposed over the centuries for why this slow transformation happened. Because the question, why did Rome fall, has occupied some of history's greatest minds for literally hundreds of years, and the answers they've proposed tell us almost as much about the historians themselves and the eras they were writing in as they do about ancient Rome.
The most famous answer, historically, comes from the 18th century English historian Edward Gibbon, whose monumental work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published across 6 volumes between 1776 and 1789, remains one of the most influential historical works ever written, even though many of its specific arguments have been significantly revised or rejected by modern scholarship. Gibbon, writing during the Enlightenment, a period deeply skeptical of organized religion's influence on rational governance, famously argued that Christianity bore significant responsibility for Rome's decline, that the rise of Christian otherworldliness, the focus on heavenly rewards rather than earthly civic duty, had sapped Roman society of the martial vigor and civic engagement that had built the empire in the first place. There's a famous, somewhat cutting line from Gibbon describing how Christian virtues, in his view, had been transformed into vices when applied to a state that needed soldiers and administrators, not monks and ascetics. Now, here's where things get genuinely interesting, because modern historians have largely moved away from Gibbon's specific religious explanation, finding it both oversimplified and not particularly well supported by the actual historical evidence. After all, the Eastern Roman Empire was, if anything, even more thoroughly and devoutly Christian than the West, and it survived for another 1,000 years. But Gibbon's broader instinct, that internal cultural and institutional factors mattered as much as, or more than, external military pressure, has remained enormously influential, even as scholars have proposed very different specific internal factors.
Some historians have pointed to economic explanations. The currency debasement we discussed earlier during the 3rd century crisis never fully resolved despite Diocletian's reforms, combined with an increasingly burdensome and inefficiently collected tax system, particularly affecting the western provinces, which simply had a smaller, less wealthy economic base than the East to begin with. There's also been significant scholarly attention paid to what's sometimes called the crisis of the curiales, the local town councilors and elites across the empire who had traditionally funded civic infrastructure, public buildings, games, and festivals out of their own pockets as a matter of civic pride and social obligation, but who, facing increasing imperial taxation demands and economic pressures, increasingly tried to evade these local civic responsibilities during the 4th and 5th centuries, leading to a slow decay of the urban infrastructure and civic culture that had been such a hallmark of Roman provincial life for centuries.
Other historians, more recently, have emphasized climate and disease in ways that earlier generations of scholars, lacking modern scientific tools, simply couldn't access. We touched on this briefly earlier, but let's sit with it a bit longer now, because it's a genuinely fascinating area of modern historical research. Using ice cores drilled from glaciers, which preserve tiny atmospheric particles and isotopes from specific years going back millennia, and using tree ring data, which can reveal year-by-year information about growing conditions and temperature going back thousands of years, climate historians have identified what's sometimes called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a period of significant cooling that began around 536 CE, likely triggered by a massive volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland or North America, that threw enormous amounts of ash and sulfur into the atmosphere, dimming the sun and disrupting agricultural patterns across much of the Northern Hemisphere for years afterward. Contemporary writers from this period describe a genuinely eerie sun that seemed to give less light and warmth than usual, crop failures, and what sounds very much like a kind of year without a summer event, centuries before the more famous 1816 event of that name caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora.
And layered right on top of this climatic disruption came something even more devastating: the plague of Justinian, beginning in 541 CE, generally now believed by modern genetic and archaeological research to have been an early outbreak of the same bacterium, Yersinia pestis, that would cause the much more famous Black Death roughly 800 years later in medieval Europe. The plague of Justinian, named after the Eastern Roman emperor reigning at the time, spread with horrifying speed and lethality through the Mediterranean world, carried initially, most historians believe, through trade networks originating in Central Asia or East Africa. The contemporary historian Procopius, writing in Constantinople, where he witnessed the plague's effects firsthand, described scenes of mass graves, abandoned bodies, and a death toll so severe that by some estimates, the city of Constantinople alone may have lost a significant percentage, perhaps a quarter or more, of its entire population during the initial outbreak in 542. The plague recurred in waves for roughly 2 centuries afterward, and some historians now estimate it may have killed somewhere between a quarter and half of the entire population of the Mediterranean world across its various outbreaks, numbers almost impossible to fully verify given the limitations of ancient record-keeping, but staggering nonetheless, even at conservative estimates.
About what that means for a moment, layered on top of everything else we've discussed tonight: political instability, economic strain, military pressure along the frontiers, and now, on top of all of that, a climatic disruption affecting agricultural yields across the empire, followed almost immediately by a pandemic potentially killing a quarter or more of the population. It's worth noting, of course, that by the time of Justinian's plague in 541, the Western Roman Empire had already formally ended decades earlier, in 476, so this particular plague's most devastating documented effects were really felt in the Eastern Empire and its Mediterranean trade partners. But it illustrates, I think, something genuinely important about the entire period we've been discussing tonight. These centuries, roughly the 3rd through the 6th,
were simply an era of unusually intense, overlapping environmental and epidemiological stress across much of Eurasia, stress that interacted with, amplified, and was amplified by the political and military pressures we've spent most of tonight discussing.
Now, let's also spend some time, because it's important and often underappreciated, talking about military and demographic explanations for the Western collapse specifically. By the 5th century, the Roman army had changed dramatically from the disciplined, heavily Romanized legions of Trajan's day. Increasingly, the Western Roman military relied heavily on foederati, allied Germanic troops fighting under their own commanders, loyal in practice more to their own leaders and peoples than to a distant, increasingly powerless emperor in Ravenna. This wasn't necessarily, in itself, a fatal weakness. Many of these Germanic commanders, men like Stilicho and Aetius, whom we discussed earlier, were genuinely skilled and for periods genuinely loyal to the Roman state they served. But it did mean that the relationship between military power and central political authority had become fundamentally different from what it had been centuries earlier, more contractual, more negotiated, more dependent on the personal relationships and loyalties of specific commanders, rather than on institutional structures that would persist regardless of who held which office.
And here's something genuinely worth sitting with. A thought that connects all the way back to where we started tonight, with that image of Trajan's empire at its absolute height. An empire that large, that complex, governing that many millions of people across that much territory, was never actually a single, simple thing. It was always, in a real sense, a coalition of provinces, of elites, of military forces, of religious institutions, held together by a combination of force, shared economic interest, cultural prestige, and yes, that powerful psychological sense of inevitability and permanence that we discussed at the very beginning. When enough of those binding forces weakened simultaneously, when the economic benefits of being Roman started to seem less clear in provinces increasingly exposed to raiding and instability, when the military became less reliably loyal to the central state, when the psychological sense of Roman permanence itself began to crack after events like the sack of 410, the coalition simply, gradually, came apart. Pieces of it reorganized themselves into new political configurations, new kingdoms, that, in the West at least, would eventually evolve over many more centuries into the medieval and then modern states of Western Europe.
Let's slow down even further now, because I want to spend some time on a question that I think is genuinely the most interesting one underlying everything we've discussed tonight. What does it actually feel like, from the inside, to live through the decline of a civilization that doesn't know it's declining? Because that's really the experience we've been describing, isn't it? Nobody living in the year 250, watching emperors rise and fall in rapid, bloody succession, thought of themselves as living through the beginning of 3 centuries of eventual Western Roman decline. They thought of themselves as living through difficult, chaotic times, the kind of times their grandparents had perhaps also lived through, the kind of times that, in living memory, had always eventually given way to renewed stability, as indeed happened for a while under emperors like Aurelian and Diocletian. Nobody living through the reign of Honorius, watching Stilicho hold the frontier together through skilled diplomacy and military maneuvering, necessarily assumed that within just a few decades, Roman administrative authority would have essentially vanished from Britain, Gaul, Spain, and North Africa. This is, I think, one of the most profound and quietly unsettling lessons of studying the fall of Rome. That decline, when you're living through it, rarely announces itself clearly. It looks, most of the time, like a series of individually manageable crises, each one difficult but survivable, the way previous difficult periods had always eventually proven survivable.
It's only with the benefit of hindsight, looking back across centuries rather than living through individual years and decades, that the larger pattern becomes visible. The way, if you stand far enough back from a slowly eroding coastline, you can see the land receding over decades in a way that's invisible if you're just standing on the beach watching one wave at a time.
And maybe there's something worth carrying with you, gently, as you drift toward sleep tonight, in that observation. Not as something frightening, but simply as a reminder of how human history actually moves. Not in clean, dramatic single moments, for the most part, but in long, slow, overlapping processes, visible clearly only in retrospect, shaped by the interaction of individual human choices and decisions. Honorius's decision to execute Stilicho, Alaric's repeated, frustrated attempts at negotiation, Odoacer's pragmatic decision to send the imperial regalia to Constantinople, with much larger, slower-moving forces, climate patterns playing out over centuries, disease patterns connected to expanding trade networks, demographic pressures originating thousands of miles away on the Central Asian steppe, individual human agency mattering enormously in specific moments, embedded within much larger patterns that no single person, however powerful, however capable, could fully see or control.
Let's spend just a little more time now on what actually happened to ordinary daily life across the former Western provinces in the decades and generations after 476, because I think it adds something important and, in its own way, genuinely comforting to our story tonight. In many regions, life continued in ways that were recognizably, functionally Roman for a remarkably long time. In southern Gaul and parts of Italy, Roman aristocratic families continued living in their villas, continued writing letters to each other in elegant, classically educated Latin, continued, in some cases, holding administrative positions, now simply serving Germanic kings, Ostrogothic kings in Italy under Theodoric, who actually consciously modeled much of his rule on Roman imperial precedent, maintaining the Roman Senate, the Roman legal system, even Roman-style public entertainments for decades after 476. Theodoric, fascinatingly, seems to have genuinely admired and sought to preserve much of Roman civilization, even as a Germanic Arian Christian king ruling over a mixed Gothic and Roman population, a detail that complicates any simple narrative of barbarian destruction replacing Roman civilization. In Gaul, the Frankish king Clovis, who converted to Catholic Christianity around 496, choosing notably mainstream Catholic Christianity rather than the Arian Christianity practiced by many other Germanic groups like the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, a choice that would prove enormously significant for the religious and political future of Western Europe, built a kingdom that drew heavily on Roman administrative precedents, even while establishing what would eventually become medieval France. Roman roads continued to be used, though increasingly without the systematic maintenance that imperial authority had once provided. Roman cities continued to exist, though many shrank significantly in population and, in some cases, saw their grand public buildings, the forums and bathhouses and amphitheaters that had once been the pride of provincial civic life, fall gradually into disrepair, sometimes literally quarried for building stone by later generations who no longer had the resources, the organizational capacity, or simply the same priorities as their Roman predecessors.
There's something I find genuinely moving when you really sit with it in archaeological evidence from this period. Excavations across the former Western Empire often show this slow, generational fading rather than sudden, catastrophic destruction. Pottery styles that had been remarkably standardized across the entire Mediterranean world during the height of Roman trade networks gradually become more localized, more regionally distinct,
as the long-distance trade networks that had once connected Britain to North Africa to Syria slowly, unevenly broke down over the 5th and 6th centuries. Coin hoards, buried by people anticipating danger, sometimes never recovered by their original owners, scattered across the former empire, offer haunting little time capsules, moments of genuine fear and uncertainty, frozen in the archaeological record, waiting patiently for over 1,000 years to be discovered by modern excavators. Before we move toward our final figure tonight, let's spend a little more time slowly on the economic machinery that quietly underpinned all of this. Because I think it's easy, when telling a story full of emperors and battles and dramatic sieges, to lose sight of the duller, slower, but ultimately more decisive grinding of economic gears beneath all that drama. And there's no rush here, none at all. So let's take our time with it.
The Roman economy, at its height, depended enormously on what economic historians sometimes call an extractive equilibrium, a careful, if often brutally unequal, balance between the wealth generated in the provinces through agriculture, mining, and craft production, and the wealth extracted by the central state through taxation, used in turn to pay soldiers, fund public works, and support the enormous city of Rome itself, which at its peak may have housed close to 1 million people, an astonishing number for any pre-industrial city, fed largely through grain shipments from Egypt and North Africa that arrived with such predictable regularity that the entire system functioned almost like clockwork, generation after generation. Think about the sheer logistical achievement that represents for a moment. Every year, enormous fleets of grain ships sailed from Alexandria in Egypt to the port of Ostia near Rome, carrying enough wheat to feed hundreds of thousands of people who themselves produced essentially none of their own food, instead working as craftsmen, laborers, soldiers, administrators, entertainers, all the diverse occupations of a great ancient metropolis. This system required not just ships and sailors, but an entire bureaucratic apparatus, officials called the praefectus annoni, responsible for managing the grain supply, dock workers, grain measurers, bakers organized into guilds with their own internal regulations, a whole intricate economic ecosystem built around the simple, fundamental necessity of keeping 1 million people fed. And here's something worth sitting with for a moment. Systems this complex, this interdependent, are remarkably efficient when everything works correctly, but they're also remarkably fragile when key components fail. When North Africa fell to the Vandals in the 430s, it wasn't simply a military defeat. It severed one of the major arteries feeding this whole intricate system. Grain shipments that had sustained Rome for centuries simply stopped or were dramatically reduced, and the population of the city of Rome itself, by some estimates, may have fallen by more than half over the following decades, not primarily through violence, but through the much quieter, much less dramatic process of people simply leaving or starving or never being born in the first place, because the economic conditions that had once supported such enormous urban density had simply ceased to exist. This is, I think, one of the most genuinely underappreciated aspects of the whole story we've been walking through tonight. How much of Rome's decline happened not in dramatic battles, but in this much quieter, much slower unraveling of economic and logistical systems that had taken centuries to build, and that, once disrupted, proved remarkably difficult to rebuild. Aqueducts that weren't repaired because the tax revenue to pay skilled engineers simply wasn't there anymore.
roads that gradually deteriorated because the systematic empire-wide maintenance program that had once kept them in excellent condition required a level of administrative coordination that increasingly fragmented political authority could no longer provide. Mines in Spain and Britain that produced less silver and gold, not because the ore had run out, but because the security, the infrastructure, the skilled labor networks needed to extract and process it had been disrupted by decades of instability.
Let's also take some time, because I think it adds real richness and humanity to this story, talking about what we know of ordinary, non-elite life during this long transformation. Because so much of what survives from antiquity, understandably, focuses on emperors and generals and bishops, the people with the resources and education to leave behind written records, while the experience of ordinary farmers, craftsmen, and laborers is much harder to reconstruct, though not impossible. Archaeological evidence from rural Gaul and Britain during the 5th and 6th centuries shows something genuinely fascinating, a real diversity of experience, varying enormously by region and circumstance. In some areas, particularly parts of southern Gaul and Italy, villa estates continued functioning in recognizably late Roman patterns for generations after the formal end of imperial authority, their owners simply adjusting to new political arrangements, paying taxes or tribute to new Germanic rulers rather than to a distant Roman emperor, but otherwise maintaining much of their previous way of life. In other regions, particularly in Britain, the archaeological evidence suggests a much more dramatic and rapid breakdown. Coin use, which had been widespread under Roman administration, declines so sharply in the archaeological record that some historians believe Britain may have largely reverted to a barter economy within just a generation or two after Roman administrative withdrawal of around 410, a remarkably swift unraveling of monetary infrastructure that had taken centuries to establish.
There's a particularly evocative piece of evidence here worth pausing on, a letter preserved by the historian Gildas, a British monk writing perhaps a century after Roman withdrawal, describing what's sometimes called the groans of the Britons, a desperate appeal reportedly sent to a Roman general named Aetius. Yes, the same Aetius we discussed earlier, the last of the Romans, pleading for military assistance against raiding Picts and Scots from the north, since Roman legions were no longer available to provide the defense Britain had relied upon for centuries. The appeal, according to Gildas, went unanswered, Aetius having far more pressing concerns on the continent, dealing with the Huns and the general collapse of Gaul. Think about what that must have felt like, to be a Romanized Britain in the 440s, watching the protective umbrella that had sheltered your grandparents and great-grandparents simply, quietly withdraw, with no replacement, no alternative system of defense ready to take its place. And yet, and this is worth pausing on too, because it complicates any simple narrative of total catastrophic collapse, Romanized British communities didn't simply vanish overnight. Roman-style hill forts were reoccupied and refortified by local British leaders. Christianity, which had taken root in Britain during the Roman period, survived and even in some respects flourished, particularly in areas like Ireland, which had never been part of the Roman Empire at all, but which received Christianity through Romanized British missionaries, most famously St. Patrick, who in his own writings describes himself as a Romanized Briton captured by Irish raiders as a young man, before later returning to Ireland as a missionary. There's something remarkable in that detail. The spread of Christianity to Ireland, an event with enormous long-term historical consequences, including the later role Irish monasteries would play in preserving classical learning during what used to be somewhat dismissively called the Dark Ages, happening as a kind of unintended ripple effect of Roman imperial collapse in Britain.
Now, let's turn for a while back to the Eastern Mediterranean, because I think the story of the Eastern Roman Empire's long continuation deserves more of our attention tonight, given how dramatically different its trajectory was from the Western collapse we've spent most of our time discussing. Under Justinian, who became Eastern Emperor in 527. The Eastern Roman state actually attempted something remarkable: a genuine, large-scale military effort to reconquer the lost Western territories and restore something approaching the old unified empire. Justinian's brilliant general Belisarius, one of the truly extraordinary military commanders of late antiquity, first crushed the Vandal kingdom in North Africa in 533 and 534 with a relatively modest expeditionary force, restoring that wealthy province to Roman control after roughly a century of Vandal rule. Then, starting in 535, Belisarius turned his attention to Italy itself, beginning what would become a brutal, exhausting, nearly 20-year war against the Ostrogothic kingdom that had ruled the peninsula since Odoacer's deposition by Theodoric back in 493. This conflict, sometimes called the Gothic War, was, by most historical accounts, catastrophically destructive for Italy, far more destructive, ironically, than the original barbarian takeover of Italy had been, with cities like Rome itself changing hands multiple times amid sieges and counter-sieges, populations decimated, infrastructure destroyed, agricultural production disrupted for a generation.
Sit with that irony for a moment, because I think it's genuinely important to understanding the complexity of this whole period. The war fought to restore Roman imperial control over Italy ended up causing more devastation to the Italian peninsula than the original transition to Gothic rule had. By the time Byzantine forces finally secured complete control around 554, Italy was, by most accounts, an economically and demographically devastated shadow of what it had been even under Gothic rule, let alone under the earlier empire. And the Eastern Roman reconquest, even where successful, ultimately proved unsustainable in the long run. Within just a few years of the war's conclusion, a new Germanic group, the Lombards, invaded Italy in 568, quickly conquering large portions of the peninsula and establishing their own kingdom, leaving the Byzantines holding only fragments of Italian territory, including, notably, the city of Ravenna, which would remain a Byzantine outpost in Italy for another 2 centuries. This pattern, I think, illustrates something genuinely important worth pausing on: the dream of restoring a unified Roman Empire, even when pursued by a capable, wealthy Eastern Roman state with skilled generals and significant resources, ultimately proved unachievable. The underlying economic and demographic realities of the post-Roman Mediterranean world having simply shifted too far from what they had been during the empire's height. The world had changed in ways that couldn't simply be reversed through military reconquest, however brilliantly executed in the short term.
Let's also take some time, because it genuinely matters for understanding the full sweep of this story, discussing how the broader Mediterranean and Near Eastern world continued transforming in the centuries after the period we focused on most tonight. In the early 7th century, the Eastern Roman Empire found itself locked in an exhausting, decades-long war against the Sassanid Persian Empire, its old rival to the east, a conflict that saw both empires bled white, their treasuries emptied, their populations decimated by years of brutal campaigning across Syria, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. And then, almost immediately after this exhausting Roman-Persian conflict finally concluded, with Roman forces under the remarkable Emperor Heraclius achieving a hard-won victory, both empires found themselves facing an entirely new and unexpected threat emerging from the Arabian Peninsula: the rise of Islam and the extraordinarily rapid Arab conquests that followed the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632. Within just a few decades, Arab Muslim armies conquered Syria, Egypt, and large portions of Persian and Roman territory in the Near East and North Africa, territories that had been Roman or Persian for centuries, sometimes for over 1,000 years in the case of Roman Syria and Egypt, falling to a new political and religious power with remarkable speed, partly because both the Roman and Persian states were so exhausted from their decades of mutual warfare that they had little capacity left to resist this new challenge. Think about that for a moment. Egypt, that wealthy agricultural province that had fed Rome and then Constantinople for centuries, that had been part of the Roman world since Augustus first annexed it after defeating Cleopatra and Mark Antony all the way back in 30 BCE, passed out of Roman control entirely by 642, a transition that, like so much of what we've discussed tonight, happened with surprising speed once the underlying conditions of stability and resilience had been sufficiently eroded by decades of prior exhaustion.
The Eastern Roman Empire, even having lost Egypt, Syria, and North Africa to these Arab conquests, nonetheless persisted, contracting to a core territory centered on Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and the Balkans, but maintaining, remarkably, a continuous political and cultural tradition tracing directly back to ancient Rome for another 8 centuries after these dramatic 7th century losses. There's something genuinely worth sitting with in that persistence, an empire that had already by this point lost so much of what we might consider its defining territories, yet which continued generation after generation, century after century, calling itself Roman, governed by emperors who saw themselves as the direct successors of Augustus and Constantine, until finally, in 1453, Sultan Mehmet II's Ottoman forces breached the ancient walls of Constantinople, walls that had protected the city for over 1,000 years, and the very last Roman emperor, a man named Constantine XI, reportedly died fighting in the breach, refusing to flee, the final chapter of a political story that had begun, if we trace it all the way back, with the legendary founding of the city of Rome itself in 753 BCE, well over 2,000 years earlier. Now, let's go back for a moment, because there's a thread I want to pick up again before we move toward the close of our story tonight. The question of what daily governance actually looked like during this long decline, the unglamorous machinery of administration that rarely makes it into the dramatic narratives of battles and sieges, but that mattered enormously to how the whole system functioned or failed to function. When Diocletian reorganized the empire in the late 3rd century, he didn't just split it administratively into eastern and western halves. He also dramatically expanded the size and complexity of the imperial bureaucracy itself in ways that historians have long debated the wisdom of. The number of provinces roughly doubled, from around 50 to around 100, each smaller province now requiring its own governor, its own administrative staff, its own tax collectors and record keepers. Diocletian also formally separated civil and military authority in most provinces, a deliberate move intended to prevent ambitious provincial governors from being able to easily combine political and military power in ways that had fueled so many of the usurpations and civil wars of the 3rd century crisis we discussed earlier. There's a real logic to this reform, and in many ways it succeeded at its immediate goal. Usurpations became somewhat less frequent for a time. The empire's basic administrative coherence was restored after decades of near collapse. But it came with real costs too, costs that historians continue to debate the significance of. A larger bureaucracy meant a larger tax burden needed to fund it, at a time when the underlying economy, especially in the western provinces, was already under significant strain. Diocletian also attempted through his famous Edict on Maximum Prices issued in 301 to combat the rampant inflation we discussed earlier by imposing price controls across the empire, fixing maximum prices for everything from wheat to lion meat to the wages of farm laborers and lawyers. The edict, fascinating as a historical document, was by most accounts a significant practical failure, leading to widespread evasion, black markets, and goods simply disappearing from official markets as merchants refused to sell at unprofitable fixed prices, a pattern that economic historians studying price controls in any era would find depressingly familiar. Diocletian also formalized and expanded a system that would have enormous long-term consequences for the social structure of the late Roman world. increasingly binding agricultural laborers, called coloni, to the land they worked, restricting their legal ability to leave and seek work elsewhere, partly as a mechanism to ensure stable tax revenue from agricultural production by preventing the kind of labor mobility that might otherwise disrupt established estates. Some historians have seen in this system an early forerunner of medieval serfdom, the social and economic arrangement that would come to define much of rural life across post-Roman Western Europe for the better part of 1,000 years afterward. Another example, worth sitting with for a moment, of how the gradual transformations happening in the later Roman period quietly shaped the medieval world that would eventually emerge from Rome's long decline, even in ways that had little to do with dramatic battles or barbarian invasions. Let's also spend a little time on the religious transformation of the later empire, because it's genuinely central to understanding how Roman identity itself changed over these centuries in ways that extended well beyond simple political administration. By the early 5th century, as we discussed, Christianity had become not just tolerated, but the empire's official religion, and this had cascading effects throughout Roman society and culture that are worth pausing on. The old pagan temples, many of them architectural marvels that had stood for centuries, were increasingly closed, sometimes converted into churches, sometimes simply abandoned and left to gradually crumble. The Vestal Virgins, that ancient Roman priesthood tending the sacred flame in the Temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum, a tradition reportedly stretching back to the legendary founding of the city itself, were finally disbanded around 394 by the Emperor Theodosius, ending a religious institution that had persisted remarkably for over 1,000 years afterward.
Think about that for a moment. An unbroken religious tradition, supposedly maintained since the very founding of Rome, simply ending by imperial decree within a single human lifetime, as the empire's religious identity transformed itself almost completely. The philosopher Hypatia, a brilliant mathematician and astronomer teaching in Alexandria, was murdered by a Christian mob in 415, a genuinely tragic episode that later became, for many subsequent historians, including Gibbon, a powerful symbol of the tensions and sometimes violent conflicts that accompanied this religious transformation, even as modern historians have worked to add more nuance and context to that often oversimplified narrative. And yet, fascinatingly, this religious transformation also created some of the most important and enduring institutions to emerge from the empire's long decline. The office of the bishop, particularly the Bishop of Rome, what would eventually become the institution of the papacy, increasingly took on civic and administrative responsibilities that the weakening imperial government was less and less able to provide. We saw this earlier with Pope Leo I's reported negotiation with Attila in 452, but this pattern continued and deepened throughout the 5th and 6th centuries. Bishops organized food distribution during famines, negotiated with barbarian kings on behalf of local populations, maintained what legal and administrative continuity remained available in increasingly fragmented territories. By the time of Pope Gregory the Great, who served as Bishop of Rome from 590 to 604, the papacy had effectively become one of the primary administrative authorities in central Italy, organizing the defense of Rome against Lombard incursions, managing extensive agricultural estates called the Patrimony of St. Peter to feed the city's population, functions that just a couple of centuries earlier would have been handled entirely by secular imperial administration. So here's something worth really sitting with as another thread in this long story of transformation rather than simple ending. The institutional church, particularly the papacy in the West, essentially absorbed and continued many of the administrative and even some of the political functions that the Roman imperial government had once provided, becoming, in a very real sense, one of the primary vehicles through which Roman administrative tradition and Roman cultural identity persisted and transformed itself across the early medieval centuries, even as formal Roman imperial governance in the West had ceased to exist.
Let me tell you about one more figure before we begin to wind down tonight, because I think his story captures something essential about this whole long, slow transformation we've been discussing. Cassiodorus was a Roman aristocrat born around 485, just a few years after the formal end of the Western Empire, who served as an administrator first under Theodoric's Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, and later after the Byzantine reconquest of Italy under Justinian's general Belisarius in the 530s and 540s, itself a fascinating, ultimately failed attempt to reunify the old Roman territories under Eastern Roman authority. Cassiodorus retired to found a monastery called the Vivarium, where he dedicated the final decades of his remarkably long life, he reportedly lived to nearly 100 years old, to an extraordinary project, preserving classical learning by having his monks copy out ancient manuscripts, both Christian and pagan, mathematical and literary, ensuring they would survive for future generations, even as the institutional infrastructure that had once supported widespread literacy and learning across the Roman world was crumbling around him.
Think about that for a moment, as a way of understanding what was actually happening during this long transformation. Here was a man who had personally witnessed Roman political authority in Italy, then watched it replaced by Gothic rule, then watched that, in turn, be devastated by a brutal decades-long war as Byzantine and Gothic forces fought back and forth across the Italian peninsula, causing, by many accounts, far more widespread destruction to Italian cities and infrastructure than the original barbarian conquests of the 5th century ever had. And his response, in the final chapter of his extraordinarily long life, was to dedicate himself to quiet, patient, careful preservation, copying manuscripts, organizing a library, training monks in the careful work of conservation, not fighting to restore the old political order, which by this point was clearly genuinely gone, but working to ensure that the accumulated knowledge, the literature, the philosophy, the mathematics of that older world would survive its political collapse, would be available for whoever came next, whatever new political forms might eventually emerge from the chaos. And in a very real sense, that work succeeded. So much of what we know about the ancient world, so much of what allowed the later Carolingian Renaissance under Charlemagne in the 8th and 9th centuries, and then the much larger Renaissance in Italy beginning in the 14th century to rediscover and build upon classical learning, traces back to exactly this kind of patient, often anonymous preservation work carried out by monks and scholars across Western Europe, and crucially, in the surviving Eastern Roman Empire and in the Islamic world too, where scholars in cities like Baghdad and Cordoba preserved and built upon Greek and Roman scientific and philosophical texts during centuries when much of Western Europe had, in certain respects, less access to that classical heritage than it once had.
So here's something worth genuinely sitting with as we begin, now to slow down and wind toward the close of our story tonight. The fall of Rome, however we choose to define and date it, was never really an ending in the simple sense. It was a transformation, often painful, often genuinely traumatic for the people living through it, but also in its long aftermath, remarkably generative. Out of that long, slow collapse came medieval Europe, with its own distinct political and cultural forms, its kingdoms and feudal structures that would themselves, over many more centuries, eventually evolve into the modern nation-states of Europe. Out of it came the preservation and eventual rediscovery of classical learning that helped fuel the Renaissance. Out of it came the Eastern Roman Empire, continuing for another 1,000 years, preserving and transmitting Roman law and Greek philosophy. Out of it even came aspects of the Islamic Golden Age, as scholars across the former Roman world, including in territories that had once been Roman provinces in North Africa and the Middle East, continued and built upon classical learning in new political and religious contexts. Nothing, really, was simply lost. Everything transformed.
And maybe that's worth holding on to, gently, as you drift now toward sleep. Not the dramatic image of barbarian hordes burning everything to the ground, though there was real violence, real trauma, real suffering woven through this story. We shouldn't pretend otherwise. but rather this quieter, slower, more patient image of Cassiodorus in his final decades in a small monastery in southern Italy, carefully training monks to copy out manuscripts by candlelight, preserving, patiently, piece by piece, generation by generation, knowledge that would outlast every emperor, every general, every political arrangement we've discussed tonight. The empire fell. The books survived. The roads crumbled. The law endured, transformed, in new kingdoms speaking new languages that had themselves evolved from Latin, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, all of them, in a very real sense, still carrying fragments of Rome forward, every single day, every time someone speaks one of those languages, every time a legal system anywhere in the world traces its principles back, however distantly, to Roman jurisprudence. So let everything we've discussed tonight settle over you now, gently, the way sediment settles slowly to the bottom of still water. All those emperors, Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, and the chaotic procession of the 3rd century, Diocletian and Constantine reshaping the empire's very structure, Honorius in his weak, fragile reign, young Romulus Augustulus fading quietly into obscurity. All those generals and kings, Alaric, seeking recognition that never quite came, Aetius, organizing one final great Roman victory before being murdered for his trouble, Attila, briefly the most feared man in the world, Odoacer, making the pragmatic decision that closed one long chapter of history. All those dates, 376 and the desperate Gothic crossing of the Danube, 378 and the catastrophe at Adrianople, 410 and the unthinkable sack of Rome, 476 and the quiet, almost anticlimactic end of the Western imperial line.
You don't need to hold on to any of it. You don't need to remember a single name, a single date, a single battle. The story will be exactly where we left it, whenever you want to return to it. Because that's the strange, comforting nature of history. It doesn't go anywhere. It simply waits, patiently, the way Cassiodorus's manuscripts waited in their monastery library, the way Roman roads waited beneath centuries of accumulated soil before archaeologists rediscovered them, the way the very language you're hearing right now, English, carries within it thousands of words that trace, however distantly, however transformed by centuries of change, back to that Latin spoken across an empire that once believed itself eternal. Empires end. That's simply true, and there's no point pretending otherwise. But what they build, what they discover, what they preserve and pass forward, even unintentionally, even through long centuries of chaos and transformation, that has a way of persisting, in forms its original builders could never have predicted or imagined. The Roman Empire as a political entity, as a single coherent state stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia, is long gone, has been gone now for the better part of 15 centuries in the West, fully gone for nearly 6 centuries even counting its long eastern continuation. But you, right now, lying there in the quiet dark, breathing slowly, drifting gently toward sleep, are still, in countless small and large ways, living within its long shadow, its long inheritance, whether you ever think about it or not.
Let that be a comforting thought, rather than a heavy one. Things end, and from their ending, other things begin. And the slow accumulation of human knowledge, human stories, human persistence, continues forward regardless, carried by patient hands across centuries, the way it's being carried right now to you. Sleep well. There's nothing more you need to do tonight, nothing more you need to remember, nothing more you need to hold on to. Just let it all drift, slowly, gently, the way an empire once did, the way everything eventually does, into something quiet and something new.